Okay, we are live now. We will wait 2 minutes and then start.
So this is sort of preliminary live.
Can you mute your mics, please? We are starting in a few minutes. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ahlam Muhtasab. I'm a professor of media studies at California State University, San Bernardino. I am also the director of the Center for the Study of Muslim and Arab Worlds at CSUSP. Welcome to our book discussion with Professor Rashid Khalidi. But let me begin by acknowledging that CSUSP sits on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Serrano Yohavitam people, also of the Tongva people throughout the Los Angeles region to the edge of San Bernardino. On behalf of the CSUSP Center for the Study of Muslim and Arab Worlds, our new center's decolonized name, and CSUSP Intellectual Life, I welcome you all to our discussion of Dr. Rashid Khalidi's latest book, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance from 1917 to 2017. So this is the book. I want everyone to see it, and we'll talk about it in more details in a minute. We are honored today to have Dr. Khalidi with us, along with my dear colleague, Dr. David Yagobian, who will introduce our esteemed speaker shortly. First, few words about our center. CSUSP Center for the Study of Muslim and Arab Worlds is a multidisciplinary center housed in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and its core mission is dedicated to broadening and decolonizing knowledge about the Muslim and Arab worlds through teaching, research, and community outreach. The center is dedicated also to be inclusive of the study of all ethnic, religious, and cultural populations in what is historically have been known as the Muslim or Islamicate and Arab worlds. Our executive board includes scholars from most colleges of CSUSP. We are also proud to house Arab Studies Quarterly, which was established in 1979 by the late Professors Edward Said and Ibrahim Abu Lughod as the first journal dedicated to Arab studies in the US. In the spring of 2018, our center jointly hosted the first Arab Studies Quarterly Conference at our CSUSP campus with the theme of US hegemony and the Arab world. Our second conference was postponed due to COVID, and now it is going to happen next year, March of 2022. You can find more information on our website, which I am actually going to put it on the screen for you in a minute. All right, this is our website if you need more information, and very soon we will have the call for proposals or the call for submissions. We are proud to have hosted over the years many educational programs like film screenings, book discussions, lectures, and panels on many topics related to our historical and geographical regions. Today is no exception, and we are proud to have Dr. Khalidi with us, who will speak about his latest book for the first 30 minutes, followed by a conversation with Dr. David Yagobian of our history department, and lastly, Q&A with the audience who are joining us literally from around the world. Like, I know people are joining from Palestine, from the Arab world, from Europe, you name it. And they are going to join us on YouTube and Facebook. And you can write your comments and we can actually get them in the chat on StreamYard. So please feel free to type your questions and we will try to answer as many as we can later in the program. So it is my pleasure now to introduce Dr. David Yagobian, who has a PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley. He is a professor of history at California State University, San Bernardino. He is co-editor with Edmund Burke III of Struggle and Survival in the Modern Middle East, second edition. He is the author of Ethnicity, Identity, and the Development of Nationalism in Iran, published in 2014. And now I will turn it to Dr. Yagobian to introduce our esteemed guest speaker. Dr. Yagobian.
Forgot to unmute. Welcome, everyone. It's our sincere honor to have Dr. Rashid Khalidi as our guest today. Dr. Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. He received his BA from Yale University in 1970 and his Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford University in 1974, and has taught at the Lebanese University, the American University of Beirut, and the University of Chicago. Dr. Khalidi was president of the Middle East Studies Association and is co-editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies. He served as an advisor to the Palestinian delegation to the Madrid and Washington Arab-Israeli peace negotiations from October 1991 until June 1993. Dr. Khalidi is the author of 8 books, including his newest book titled, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017, as well as Palestinian Identity, The Construction of Modern National Consciousness, which is out in a revised edition in 2010. Dr. Khalidi has also co-edited 3 other books and published over 110 academic articles. He has written op-eds in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other newspapers, and has appeared widely on TV and radio in the US and abroad. Dr. Rashid Khalidi, welcome.
Thank you so much, David. I'm still learning to unmute myself after a year of living on these media. Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you, Ahlam, and to everybody at UCSB for hosting me. I'm very happy to be able to talk to you in sunny California. I speak from frigid but sunny New York, where we've had snow on the ground for the last month, pretty much, finally melting. I'm going to talk about my book, and I'm going to talk about 5 or 6 specific things. I'm going to talk about how I came to write the book. I'm going to talk about how it differs from the other books that I've written, some of which David just mentioned. I'm going to talk about why I specifically used the title of the 100 Years' War on Palestine. And secondly, why, or fourthly, I should say, why I employ the subtitle of Settler Colonialism and Resistance. I'll say a little bit about the structure of the book, how I organized it in the different chapters. And finally, I may say a little bit about how I see a possible solution to this 100 Years' War. How I came to write the book. I had written a number of books. One of them, Professor Yagobian mentioned, the book Palestinian Identity, on different aspects of Palestinian history, and books on other topics, on the United States and the Middle East, on Arab nationalism, on British policy. But all of them had been written in an academic register. In other words, employing the disciplinary approach that I had been taught from the time I was an undergraduate through my graduate training in England, and had continued to use for everything, every scholarly article I wrote and every one of the books I wrote or edited. And I was sailing along doing that when my son, Smaid, who's a playwright, and so is someone who is used to speaking to audiences and addressing audiences. He's a former actor, he's now a playwright, said to me, Pa, it's about time that you address ordinary people and talk about some of these important issues relating to Palestine in a way that is accessible to people who don't have PhDs or who are not historians or who are not well versed in this issue. It's time to write something accessible. It's time to write something relatable. It's time to write something in your own voice. One of my cousins, Nawaf Slam, also urged me in the same direction. He said, you know, there's no good, simple, straightforward history of Palestine. Edward Said, many decades ago, wrote a book called The Question of Palestine. And that is, it's not a history. It's a primer and an introduction to the issue of Palestine, especially for American readers. But since then, there has been nothing. And there has been nothing written by a historian and that tells the story of the history of this place and of this people. And both Nawaf and my son Smaid urged me constantly. I mean, they would not let go. In fact, they were very, very annoying, both of them, especially my son, who has a particular way of annoying me. And he did it until finally he said, look, I'll sit down with you and we can sketch out how you can do this. Because I was resisting. I was saying, you know, I've written what I've written, and this is the way I write, and I'm not going to change. And I was a little bit stubborn. Finally, they convinced me, especially Smaid. And so I came to this project not so much with misgivings, but with a sense that maybe I don't know how to do this. How do I write a book that is both historically rigorous and at the same time is relatable, is something that someone who is not well versed in this subject is going to be able to appreciate. That brings me to the second thing I want to talk about, which is how this book differs from everything else that I've ever written, especially the books and academic articles that I've written. I was convinced, essentially again by my son, that it was time to bring in my own personal experiences. My kids would always say to me, would always ask us questions, myself and my wife, you know, what happened in Beirut? What happened? They would ask us questions about their grandparents, about my parents and Muna's parents and their parents. And in telling these stories to my children, they came to realize that this was one way of approaching the history of Palestine. And so Smaid said to me, tell stories that, you know, you yourself have been told. I said, well, I can also tell stories based on things that I've read, memoirs by members of the family and by others. And he said, fine, as long as these are personal accounts. So the book is much more based than anything I've ever written on memoirs of a variety of people, many of them members of my own family or members of my wife's family or other families or people who I knew. I use the memoirs, for example, of Yusuf Saïgh, who I knew. I know his distinguished wife, Rosemary Saïgh, one of the most famous anthropologists, probably the doyen of anthropologists of Palestine. And I know his kids. So reading his memoirs, I know more than there's actually in the memoir. I used that. I used other memoirs. I used things that I had been told. I had benefited over many, many years from listening to older members of the family tell stories, their own experiences, things that they'd heard. In particular, 3 of my aunts, all of whom had fantastic stories about when they were young. One of them, my Aunt Ambara, actually wrote her memoirs. But I talked to her extensively about work that I was doing on early Arab nationalists, including a person who had been his fiancé before he was hanged by the Ottoman authorities during World War I. And so I drew on those things that had been told to me by members of the family and by other people, as well as finally on my own personal experiences. As I got closer and closer to the present in the narration of Palestinian history in this book, I began to draw not just on the accounts of other people, my uncle's memoirs, my wife's grandfather's memoirs, but also on things that I had been told, and then things that I myself had witnessed. Things that I had witnessed, for example, in the Security Council. My father worked for the United Nations. He was a member of the UN Secretariat. He was in a division called Political and Security Council Affairs. It's now the Division of Political Affairs. And his job was to attend Security Council meetings on the Middle East and to help write up what had happened and present the documentation that was necessary to the Security Council members. So every Security Council meeting that related to the Middle East was attended by my father until his death in 1968, from the early 50s until 1968. And he would come home and tell us stories about what had happened in the Security Council. Israeli planes attacked Syrian positions. There was a clash along the Jordanian border, and he would tell us what they actually knew what had happened, what the people, the various ambassadors, representatives of different countries had said. And also, as time went on, I learned from behind the scenes all kinds of things that were happening at the United Nations. So I put a little bit of that into the book. And then again, as I got closer to the present, I began to retell my own experiences. Living in Beirut at a time when the PLO was forced to leave Jordan and move to Lebanon. Living in Beirut during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the siege of Beirut, and later the massacres in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in the summer of 1982. Things that I had, been present and witnessed. I didn't witness the massacres, but I retell a story about how I became aware of the massacres. So I put a great deal of myself, of family, of other people's memoirs, of stories that I had been told into this book, and it therefore differs entirely from anything I've ever written. I tried to, as carefully as possible, document what I was saying. There are 45 pages of footnotes. So for anyone who wants to check or go further or learn more about the things that I'm talking about in the book, there is a scholarly backbone to it that they can go to refer to further sources. But you can read the book as a story, as a story that I'm trying to tell based on these kinds of disparate sources, as well as a variety of documentary sources, some of them involving documents that have never before been published. An American ambassador to Lebanon gave me his private papers. I was able to access the secret annexes to the Kahan Commission report, the Israeli government's Kahan Commission report on the Sabra and Shatila massacres. I use those kinds of documents as well as the kinds of memoirs and personal material that I've just talked about. So this is, as far as I was able to do it, a rigorously documented history, but told in some parts in the first person, and in some parts through the eyes of participants whose memoirs or whose stories, as they were told to me, I use in the book. So that's how this book differs from everything else I've ever written. It has a through line. It has a basic argument. It's not simply a collection of stories. I sum that argument up in the title and the subtitle, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So it is not a memoir by any means. Again and again, my editor, my excellent editor at Metropolitan Books, made me take out personal material that I thought was fascinating. Once I got into writing this stuff, I sometimes I couldn't stop. And she said, that has nothing to do with the story that you're telling. The main story that you're telling is not about yourself. It's about the history of Palestine along the lines that you're laying out here in this book. And this takes us on a tangent away from that. So it is by no means a memoir, though there is a lot of personal and family and other memoir material from other people in the book. So that's how I came to write the book, and that's how it differs from other things that I've written about the history of Palestine. I want to talk now about why I used the title, The 100 Years War on Palestine. To some extent, this was a coincidence, because when I'm trying to take a break from work, my own academic work, reading students' dissertation chapters or correcting papers or writing, doing my own scholarly work, I read all kinds of stuff. I read mystery novels, I read Faulkner or Conrad, whatever I want to read. But I also read history that has nothing to do with the Middle East, ideally medieval history. And I had been reading a lot about the 100 Years' War between the crowns of England and France. And that topic stuck in my head, the 100 Years' War, and I was saying to myself, well, this thing has been going on for about 100 Years' War. So I adopted that frame, and somebody said to me, yeah, but this is going to go on for long after your book is written, probably. And of course, they're right. We're now in 2021. We're now on 104 years, or more if you count the conflict as starting a little bit earlier. And then I realized that actually the 100 Years' War between the English and French crowns went on for 117 years. So the 100 Years' War is a sort of a metaphor. And I use it very purposely because most ways of narrating the history of Palestine, first of all, foreground not the Palestinians or Palestine. They foreground Israel, Zionism, and the Jewish people. And secondly, they see this at best as a tragic conflict between two peoples, sort of like France and Germany, or Britain and France in the time of Napoleon. And this conflict has no resemblance. It bears no resemblance whatsoever to those kinds of conflicts between two powers. First of all, there's only one power involved. There's the state of Israel. And before that, there's the Zionist movement. The Palestinians have never had a state. The Palestinians were always, as I try and show in this book, at an enormous disadvantage. And the Palestinians were always up against more than just the Zionist movement and the state of Israel. They were always up against the Zionist movement and its external ally, Great Britain, and the League of Nations, whose mandate Britain was carrying out in Palestine between the early 20s and 1948. So the Palestinians were up against enormous odds. And I'm arguing here that what was happening was not a war between Palestinians and Israelis or Palestinians and the Zionist movement, but a war on Palestine, which was, in fact, sanctioned and approved at every stage by the greatest power of the era. The conflict in Palestine in the 20s and 30s was mainly between the British and the Palestinians. And it was the British who crushed the Palestinians, not the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement did not have that capability in the 1920s or 1930s. What crushed the Palestinians when they rose up in revolt against what was happening in their homeland was the might of the British Empire. Over 100,000 British troops, airmen, colonial police, auxiliaries, who were fighting against the Palestinians for 3.5 long years between the spring of 1936 and the end of 1939. So this was a war on Palestine waged in every case in furtherance of the aims of the Zionist movement, but by the Zionist movement and later the State of Israel and its great power backer, whether that was Great Britain during the Mandate period, whether that was the United States and the Soviet Union at the time of the Partition Resolution of 1947 and the 1948 war, or whether that was Britain and France later on, or whether that for the last 30 or 40 years, since really 1967, has been the United States. The United States, in other words, has been waging war together with Israel on the Palestinians. And I show this in as much detail as I can in the different chapters of the book, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So the first thing that I'm trying to show through this title and through the framework of the book is that this is not a simple struggle between two peoples or between two national movements or between right and right. It has a specific nature in terms of the external support that was always enjoyed, first by the Zionist movement and second by the State of Israel. That's pretty much apparent to people in the 2020s. The fact that the United States has been putting its big fat thumb on the scale for decades, and that you don't just have very powerful nuclear-armed Israel against the relatively weak Palestinians, you have Israel plus the United States. Many people, I think, have figured that out, but that was not always apparent to people, and especially for an older generation, the image that they have is of tiny little beleaguered Israel being assailed, besieged by hordes of Arabs. Among whom are, of course, the Palestinians. And I'm trying to shatter that entirely false notion, which is deeply held, especially by many older people, in part with the title. I'm trying to shatter another set of false understandings with the subtitle. Settler colonialism and resistance, in my view, is the framework through which this 100 Years' War has to be understood. Britain was seeking to implant what it and the Zionist movement saw as a settler colony. Now, the British and the Zionists saw this as a settler colony of the Jewish people, saw it as a national project. It was a national project. In fact, the argument that there are two national movements here is not entirely incorrect. There are now two national movements here. There's a Palestinian national movement, and there is the movement created by Zionism, which has developed into a thriving modern nation state, the nation state of Israel, which is a nation state for the Jewish people. So it is an exclusive, specific type of nation state. And there is a national aspect to it. I'm not in any way trying to deny that. In fact, what I'm trying to say with this book is that you can be a settler colony and a nation state at the same time. We live in one. In the introduction to our talk, the original tribal peoples on whose land UCSB exists were mentioned. I live on the island of Manhattan, which the Lenape people owned once upon a time and inhabited, and which was taken away from them by force. We live in a settler colony. That's something that, until people like Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, and the work of some other scholars came out, a lot of people didn't want to realize or recognize. We live in a successful settler colony. A nation state has been created through this process of settler colonialism. And that is also true in Canada, that's also true in Australia, that's also true in New Zealand. That does not negate the fact that we have a nation in this country, a nation state, there's a national existence, does not negate the settler colonial origins of that state. And I'm saying the same thing is true of what happened in Palestine. A settler colonial movement was successfully implanted through the efforts of a great power in the metropole, and later on other great powers, and developed ultimately into a successful national project, of the project of Israel, a nation state for as long as I've been alive, since 1948. And so what I'm saying here is, yes, you can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can be a settler colonial project, and you can be a national project. And that is exactly what Zionism was and is. You cannot, however, deny the settler colonial nature of the project. Not only because reading the history, especially the early history, or looking at the history of what has happened in the West Bank since 1967, cannot be understood except in settler colonial terms. You can talk about the ancestral connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel until the cows come home. But the processes were settler colonial processes. Not only were they settler colonial processes, the Zionist movement reveled in calling itself a settler colonial movement. Read Herzl, read Jabotinsky, read Weizmann, read Ben-Gurion's diaries, especially read their diaries, their private musings. But in many cases, they're public statements, especially Jabotinsky, by far the most frank, honest, and straightforward Zionist leader of his age. None of them make any bones about the fact that we are coming in, we're Europeans, yes, we're Jews, yes, we have a connection to this land, but we're coming in to replace the Palestinians, to take their place. We want to create Israel, a Jewish state in the place of an overwhelmingly Arab country. So I think that arguing against the settler colonial nature of Israel is an entirely futile endeavor, unless you completely ignore history, including the history of the Zionist movement itself, especially in its first few decades. One of the major agencies that was engaged in purchasing land in Palestine, the Zionist movement succeeded in purchasing about 6% of the land of Palestine before 1948, after which they stole most of the rest. The agency that was engaged in doing that called itself the Jewish Colonization Agency. This is not some anti-Semitic slur by some bigoted historian. This is what they called themselves, the Jewish Colonization Agency. I think you can't have any franker admission on the part of one of the central agencies of the Zionist project that what was undertaken, for all of its national nature, was essentially a colonial project. And I try and argue that in the subtitle and throughout the course, of course, of the rest of the book. The last element in the title, which is resistance, is something that I think has to be underlined again and again and again. Everything the Palestinians have done, like everything every colonized people has ever done, is always coded as banditry or terrorism or criminal action. It is never coded as an absolutely dialectical response of resistance to the aggression of a settler colonial project. What the Native American population in North America did was to try and defend their patrimony. They did not attack the settlers. It's the settlers who came and took their land, promising them one thing and then betraying those promises again and again and again throughout American history, right up until the 20th century, to the end of the 20th century, in fact. That's the same kind of thing that happened in Algeria. That's the same kind of thing that happened in Rhodesia. That's the same kind of thing that happened in Australia or Canada or South Africa. Settler colonialism is extraordinarily diverse in its nature. You go from places like Ireland, where you've had 800 or 900 years of settler colonialism, to places like Palestine, which is one of the last, actually one of the last settler colonial projects in human history, or at least in modern history. And each one is entirely different, but there are some constants. And one of them is this kind of project will engender resistance. Inevitably, necessarily, dialectically, it always happens. It has to happen. The person who I think best sums it up from a Zionist point of view is Vladimir Jabotinsky, the intellectual and spiritual father of what is called the revisionist tendency in Zionism, which has in fact been the dominant tendency in Israeli politics since 1977, when Menachem Begin won the election, became prime minister. Most of the prime ministers of Israel since then, with a couple of exceptions, have been members of the Likud party, which is the modern extension of revisionist Zionism, founded by and led by Jabotinsky. And Jabotinsky in his writings is absolutely explicit. Of course, what we're doing is going to provoke resistance from the Palestinians. Every people resists what we're trying to do. It's natural, normal, and understandable. We just have to be stronger and impose ourselves by force. There was no pretense that this was something that was good for the Palestinians. There was no pretense that what was envisioned by the Zionist movement was some kind of peaceful coexistence. No, what was envisioned was a replacement of one group by another group, if necessary, by force. And the person who was bluntest about that was Jabotinsky. The rest of them were often blunt privately, but very rarely as frank and honest and unvarnished in their public statements. Let me talk a little bit. I didn't want to talk for more than 30 minutes. Let me talk a little bit about the structure of the book. I won't go into detail. I won't talk about each chapter. But I want to explain why I used the structure I used. I use a structure of declarations of war. I'm suggesting in the book, of course, that this is a 100 years war on Palestine. And I use a structure of declarations of war in order to show that each phase of the history of Palestine was opened up by what I call a declaration of war. The Balfour Declaration was a declaration of war. Great Britain was saying in the Balfour Declaration, which later is incorporated into the League of Nations mandate for Palestine, Britain is saying, there's one people in Palestine. It's the Jewish people. There's one group with national rights. It's the Jewish people, and therefore with political rights. Everybody else doesn't exist as a people. There's no other people mentioned in the Balfour Declaration. The mandate for Palestine, under which Britain operated from World War I until 1948, is based on the Balfour Declaration. It is a declaration of war because it says there is one people, it's the Jewish people. The Palestinians are never named, never mentioned by name. Arab, the word Arab doesn't exist in the mandate for Palestine or in the Balfour Declaration. And all that is given to them are civil and religious rights, not political rights, not self-determination, not nationhood, not even peoplehood. This is a declaration of war. In a country, 94% of whose population is Arab, to not mention them and to talk only about another national group, which you're bringing into being in their country, is a declaration of war. The British actually carry out the war many years later, in the late 30s, in crushing the Great Arab Revolt. I argue that the partition resolution of 1947, rammed through the United Nations General Assembly by bribery, arm twisting, bludgeoning, and other unsavory means, is another declaration of war. A country that had been promised self-determination under the UN Charter, a country that had been promised self-determination under the Covenant of the League of Nations, was being partitioned, and most of it was being given to a minority. Instead of the country as a whole getting self-determination, which was under international law, under the UN Charter, under the Covenant of the League, their right, they were being told, most of your country is going to go to this minority group. And I argue this was in effect a declaration of war on the Palestinians. A bunch of spurious arguments are made. Why didn't the Palestinians share? I can go into those arguments later if people are interested. A third declaration of war, I would argue, and this is how I frame it, is not the 67 war so much as Security Council Resolution 242, drawn up essentially by the Americans, with the British Lord Carradine, the British representative, as the drafter, but it was an American resolution essentially, which embodied Israeli aspirations. It was an American-Israeli resolution, if you really want to know. Though, as I say, Lord Carradine was the one who wrote it. And I explain why Security Council Resolution 242, which again, like the Balfour Declaration, never mentions the Palestinians. It mentions a just resolution of the refugee problem. Which refugee problem, who they are, what a just solution is, no mention. It is, in effect, I'm arguing in this book, a declaration of war. I talk about the 1982 war in terms of a joint American-Israeli endeavor. Sharon doesn't make war on the Palestinians in 1982 on the basis of waking up one morning and deciding to go to war and getting Menachem Begin to go along. He goes to war after going to Washington and getting the American Secretary of State, General Haig's, approval for his precise war aims, and is told, we have the minutes of the meeting from an assistant to Haig, green light for this. The United States approves of this war. It's an American-Israeli war. It's a war fought with American weapons. It's a war fought with the United States shielding Israel in the United Nations from any kind of condemnation. It's a war that is fought for Israeli objectives, which the United States helps to further in its diplomacy during and after the war, up to and including the shameful episode of the Sabra and Shatila massacres. I won't go through the other chapters. Each of them embodies that kind of framing, seeing these episodes in Palestinian history as launched by a declaration of war, usually by one of the great powers, or usually involving one of the great powers. People have often asked me, why don't you mention this conflict, the 73 war? Why don't you mention the Suez War of 1956? I could discuss why I picked the episodes I picked for the 6 declarations of war, but I think that framing is valid in terms of seeing things as they were. I can talk a little bit about the kind of solution that I hope could be envisaged to end this 100 years of war. I won't say very much right now, except to stress that any solution, a one-state, a multi-state, a confederal solution, any solution has to be based on absolute equality of rights for all concerned, for both peoples, there are no 2 peoples there, and for all individuals. National rights, civil rights, political rights, religious rights, cultural rights, human rights, all forms of rights. One set of people cannot have their rights on the basis of suppressing the rights of other people. Israelis today have security by creating insecurity of occupation and expulsion for Palestinians. That is immoral, unjust, and most importantly, for those people who are pragmatists, unsustainable. In the 21st century, you cannot maintain that kind of a system of fundamentally unjust, fundamentally discriminatory infringement on the rights of an entire people in order to supposedly assure the rights of another people. So whatever solution to this war, whatever means of ending this war is ultimately sought, it has to be based on some basis in justice. It has to be based on equity, on absolute equality of rights for all concerned. And how you get to that is not going to be easy. I fully understand that. Dismantling privilege, as I think we're beginning to learn in the United States, is a complex and difficult process. We're nowhere near it here. I don't expect that it's going to be easy in Palestine, or it's going to happen very soon. But if you don't see things in that way, if you don't see that the privilege that has accrued to one group at the expense of another group has to somehow be addressed, that this is a result of a process whereby one people has been subjugated in this colonial settler war, and another people has benefited from those results, you cannot have a just or a sustainable outcome. Let me stop there.
Thank you. I'm on, and I have my mic unmuted. Dr. Khalidi, thank you so much. I appreciate not only, of course, the talk that you just gave, but also I found your book to be truly unique within the historiography of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I teach the subject at the undergraduate level, and in terms of secondary source material, this is truly a unique perspective, and is just so rich due to the narratives that you provide from your own family history, your wife's family history. I've found it truly enlightening, and I'm saying that as someone who's been teaching and studying the subject for going on now 3 decades. So
thank you.
Particularly, and maybe this is just my own selfish interest in specific portions of your book that I found so much more enlightening than the sources that I've read previously. But I have a series of 3 interrelated questions that relate generally to your experience in the Madrid talks in the early 90s and the issue of a 2-state solution. So this is sort of a grouping of 3 here. But my first question on that note is to ask you if you ever envisioned a viable 2-state solution or a potential path to a 2-state solution. And if so, when was that? And in what form or under what parameters? Based on my reading of your book, despite the core problems with UN 242, which you just described, if ever this would have been the 1992 Palestinian Interim Self-Governing Authority proposal. So could you just talk a little bit about that? Was there ever a viable plan for a 2-state solution?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let me back up and talk about myself and how many Palestinians saw this. For a long time, from the late 60s onwards, most Palestinians assumed that the best outcome available would be some kind of liberated Palestine in which all Israeli Jews and all Palestinian Arabs could live together as citizens on a basis of equality. For a variety of reasons, the Palestinian leadership in the 70s moved away from that and moved towards a 2-state solution. And by 1988, they had explicitly adopted a 2-state approach. Many of us were skeptical, but over time came around to it. Edward Said was skeptical, but I think like him and like many others, we assumed that the PLO leadership was responding to pressure, some of which we knew about from the Arab states, from the Soviet Union, from the international, the global, from the world, to move towards a 2-state solution. I was never deeply convinced, but I was certainly willing to give it a try, or I wouldn't have spent all that time in Madrid and Washington over 2.5 years trying to negotiate a 2-state solution. Obviously, I believed in it enough to try and achieve it. I did not know then. I had not, I had worked on this topic a little bit previously, but I did not know then what I know now about the closeness of the American-Israeli relation. I knew, I'd grown up in the United States, I knew the closeness of the United States to Israel, but I did not know that the United States was committed by understandings between the 2 governments to never going beyond the Israeli position on Palestine without Israeli permission. This is an undertaking that Kissinger gave to Israel in 1975, and it's embodied in a letter from President Ford to I think it's then Prime Minister Rabin. In any case, I didn't know that. Had I known that, maybe I wouldn't have gone to Madrid. I also didn't know other things that I later on found out. But what we tried to do, which is to say what the Palestinian delegation, with the advice of people like myself and a number of others, Camille Mansour, Rashid Khalidi, a number of other people, tried to do, was to put together a framework within the very constraining limits that were imposed on us by the United States at the instigation of Israel, which would ultimately lead to self-determination. And so in this Palestinian Interim Self-Governing Authority, we argued this authority has to have jurisdiction over the entire territory. Now, that was not sovereignty. That was not statehood. That was not self-determination. But it was the farthest we could go, and it was the hook on which ultimately statehood and sovereignty could be achieved. It went nowhere. It went nowhere with the Israelis. It went nowhere with the Americans. We now know why. The United States was constrained by prior accord with Israel not to go beyond the Israeli position. In fact, often the Israelis went beyond the American position. I retell a story in the book about how an American bridging proposal was less forthcoming than the last thing that the Israelis had offered us. So, I mean, you're bridging who? This is a bridge between you and the Israelis. The Israelis are farther ahead than you are on this issue. And so I think that once that went down the tubes, I should add the PLO leadership, I don't think took it as seriously as they should have. I don't think they understood some of the basic contours of what was necessary to achieve self-determination. They figured once we get into the room, once we can get into Palestine, we'll work it out. It was a sort of, we'll toss stuff up in the air and hope it'll come down in the right place approach, which is characteristic of Arafat in his dealings, for example, with Arab governments, and it sometimes works. Doesn't work with the Israelis. You got to plan and think legally and so on. And we were beginning to do that, I think, in Washington. But in any case, it went nowhere. From that point on, I ceased to have very much hope for a two-state solution, especially when I saw all that Israel was willing to concede in the Oslo Accords that were announced in September of 1993. It was perfectly clear that self-determination was not going to be an outcome, that statehood, that sovereignty, that an end to settlements, Palestinian capital in Jerusalem, those things were not going to be an outcome of the Oslo Accords. Now, the PLO leadership fooled itself into thinking that that was possible. They were completely wrong. I wrote an op-ed. I refused to go to the ceremony. I was invited. I refused to go to the White House lawn ceremony. And I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times the day that it took place, in which I said, this is not going to go in the right direction. So I guess I figured it out sometime during the negotiations, that at least that what I saw as a window, what I saw as an opening, in fact, either had closed or was never there. Let me say one more thing, which is that I had been encouraged by some of the positions taken by the Bush administration and by the Secretary of State, James Baker, into the mistaken belief that the United States might see this as a vital national interest and do something about it. I was wrong. And in any case, we had no opportunity to test this for two reasons. Baker left the State Department much too early. Three reasons. Bush was defeated in the 1992 elections, and Rabin came to power and then was assassinated 3 years later. So were certain things possible with Rabin, which I'm not sure they would have been? Would Bush have, in a second term, done something differently? Maybe not. Would Baker have continued to be somewhat more sympathetic to the Palestinians than his successors were? I don't know. Probably not. But in any case, history didn't give us a chance to see those outcomes.
Unmute. Thank you. That you actually addressed the second portion, or rather second question that I had, and I guess if I interpret correctly, then therefore the signing of Oslo, the DOP, was really the writing on the wall for you that a two-state solution was not forthcoming.
Absolutely.
In that context, and specifically then the failure of the Oslo two-state peace process charade, what, in your view, is the significance of the B'Tselem report and declaration? And this is the report by the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, B'Tselem, titled "A Regime of Jewish Supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. This is Apartheid." What, in your view, is the significance of this report for a one-state solution going forward, if any significance? Because many have cited its statement of the obvious. Excuse me.
We're being told by, in this case, a credible Israeli institution, what Palestinians have been saying for the better part of a century, and what other Israelis, actually, to be fair, have said, including many Israeli leaders, which is that the emperor has no clothes and is butt naked. I mean, this is as obvious as day. There is a system of supremacy for one people over the other in Palestine. That was always what Herzl envisaged. You just have to read his diaries. You just have to read his writings, his public writings. It's what every Zionist leader envisaged. Mm-hmm. They didn't come to have an Arab-Jewish state. They didn't come to Palestine to live as a minority. The Zionism diagnoses the Jewish condition as requiring an exit from Europe, a reestablishment of a Jewish homeland, and a Jewish state. It does not envisage an Arab Jewish state. It doesn't envisage a Jewish majority. And so, this was always the objective. I'm constantly amazed at people's capability to deceive themselves into assuming something different. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I'm very grateful to B'Tselem. I'm very grateful to Michael Sfard, who's an author of another similar report, a very courageous Israeli lawyer. And frankly, to various Israeli leaders, Ehud Barak and various others, who've said something similar. We're moving towards apartheid, or we're going to be at apartheid, or we're at apartheid. I don't think it's actually apartheid. I think these comparisons between settler colonial projects are very often flawed. In many ways, it's worse than apartheid. In many ways, it's different than apartheid. I mean, yes, there's a pass system. Yes, there are two legal systems. Yes. But you only have to read somebody like Mahmoud Mamdani to see all the differences, and to see that this is a unique system. It is, the important thing is, it is fundamentally discriminatory. That's the key. That's the core. It does involve separation. I mean, look at Israel. They have two school systems. Arab citizens of Israel don't go to the same schools as Jewish citizens of Israel. Look at Arab municipalities. They don't have control over their borders. They're hemmed in. They are forced to build on top of each other. This is rank, gross discrimination. It's Jim Crow writ large. I personally prefer Jim Crow because we're more familiar with Jim Crow than we are with apartheid. I'm still learning as I read. I learn things about apartheid that I didn't know. And I think that anybody who's not a South Africa expert, nobody in the United States has the right not to know about Jim Crow and segregation. We all, if we don't know it, we should be ashamed of ourselves. And there's so many parallels. There's no sign saying whites only in Israel, but there's a two-stream system, and that's inside Israel. That doesn't even count the incredibly degrading treatment of a population that's lived for 3 generations under absolute control of the Israeli military. Every important decision for 5 million people for 3 generations has been made by corporals, sergeants, captains, and ultimately the coordinator for activities in the occupied territories. Every decision. Can you register your child in the population registry? The Israelis decide. Can you enter? The Israelis decide. Can you leave? The Israelis decide. Can you move from this place? The Israelis decide. Can you dig a well? Can you build? Except for in a few areas where building is allowed, area A, few percent of the land area of the West Bank. So this is a system of rank discrimination, of segregation. You can call it apartheid, or you can call it Jim Crow, or you can call it whatever you want. It's discriminatory. It's fundamentally unequal. And it is not simply inside the state of Israel that you have this discrimination. It's not simply inside the state of Israel. In the entire area of Palestine, which is controlled by one state and has been controlled by one state since the end of the June War in 1967, there are 2 sets of laws. And even inside Israel, there are other forms of discrimination where there's nominally one set of laws, but only one people has the nationality, the Jewish nationality, which entitles them to certain things in Israel. The nation-state law, nation-state of the Jewish people law of July 2018 makes that absolutely clear. Israel is a nation-state of the Jewish people. And only one people has the right of self-determination in Israel. And since the state of Israel has now expanded de facto to include the entirety of mandatory Palestine, that's a statement that we don't exist. I mean, that is, when you talk about settler colonialism, one of the things you talk about is how you eliminate the existence of the native. They don't have the right to be there. They're there on sufferance. We allot them reservations. They do not have constitutional protections. They did not have the right to vote until very recently. All of these things are examples of people living within the United States who are the original population of this land and who are treated that way. Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel, who form about 20% of the population, they don't live in that exact situation. But these are parallels that I think can be made. If this is a nation state of the Jewish people, and only that people has the right of self-determination, then all kinds of other things that go with that do not apply to the 20% of the citizens of this state. So you have one form of particularly awful discrimination and oppression for the population under occupation, the 5.5 or whatever it is million in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and you have a different form of segregation, discrimination, and do a legal system, and in effect do a legal norms applied to the citizens of the state.
Thank you. On a directly related note, this was just last week, in an interview with Gray Zone reporter Aaron Mate about the International Criminal Court case, Norman Finkelstein argues that the ICC paradigm, as he refers to it, that is, that there is a state of Palestine that is being occupied and on which a body of international law applies, has been made irrelevant by the reality on the ground for the past 54 years, as detailed in the B'Tselem report. And as Dr. Finkelstein mentioned, 54 years is more than twice as long as the initial establishment of the State of Israel between 1948 and 1967. So for 54 years, there has been this reality of the colonial settler project, as well as from the Mediterranean to the Jordan Zionist or Israeli control. So in that context of a single Jewish supremacist state between the Jordan and Mediterranean, leaving only the one-state paradigm as a viable reality, Dr. Finkelstein concludes that his efforts have up till now been directed towards the UN, international law, ICC paradigm, but that reality now dictates different conclusions and approaches going forward. Do you agree?
Yeah. This is a question that, frankly, I think the Palestinians have to ask themselves. There are many Palestinians who are still very attached to the two-state approach. In fact, both of the major Palestinian political factions, unrepresentative though I think they are in many respects, Fatah and Hamas, are actually quite attached to the two-state paradigm. They very much want an independent Palestinian state, which of course each of them wants to rule. That's another issue, the rivalry between them. And I think there are elites, especially in the occupied territories, for whom ending occupation and achieving self-determination, just getting the Israeli boot off their neck, a perfectly understandable sentiment, is the be-all and the end-all. For them, the Palestine question boils down to what they are suffering from. I'm not saying everybody in the occupied territories, but some of the elites, I think, have this as their primary focus. Whatever they may say about the entire Palestinian people, whatever they may say about the Palestinian diaspora, whatever they may say about the right of return and the rights of people like myself who go there on sufferance. I don't have any right to be in my ancestral homeland. I have to get a visa, and if they don't give me a visa, I can't enter. And I can only stay 3 months. So I think one of the issues here is the continued attachment of a lot of people to a two-state paradigm, which I think is completely tattered. I don't think the only problem is that we've had 54 years of bulldozers in operation to make sure that a two-state solution cannot come about. Israel has worked day and night for 54 years to ensure that under no circumstances can there ever be an independent, contiguous, sovereign Palestinian state. That is one of the lodestones of Israeli policy for every single day of the past 54 years. They have done everything possible, either to destroy the Palestinian national movement, to assassinate its leaders, to subjugate and divide the Palestinians, to cement over as much as possible of the occupied territories, to take over as much of the land, to annex bits of it in de jure and de facto, to basically absorb it all. And that has been directed among almost primarily, not so much at establishing the Greater Land of Israel project, which is a project of the Israeli right. And it's been particularly, it's on steroids for the last many years. But in terms of a shared project, which is to prevent any other sovereignty in the land of Palestine. That was what the 2018 Knesset resolution, which has constitutional force, was about, adopted by a wide range of deputies across the spectrum. This was not a Likud resolution. This was not a revisionist Zionist resolution. This was a widely supported resolution, which expressed an aim of Zionism since the beginning, to establish the sole exclusive sovereignty of the Jewish people in the entirety of the land of Israel. Now, how you establish a Palestinian state in a situation not just where that's the objective of one side, but where that has been the practice of one side for 54 years, is, to my way of thinking, the question that every advocate of a two-state solution has to face. How do you undo what the bulldozers and the concrete mixers have done for 54 years? They have created a one-state reality. They have created a situation where you have almost 700,000 voting Israeli citizens whose entire lives would be destroyed if they were obliged to leave the homes that have been illegally built for them by massive subsidies and mainly American money over the past 54 years. Look at the proportion of the Jewish citizens of Israel who now live in settlements. And you see the near political impossibility of a project which involves undoing what 54 years have wrought. So I think that's one issue. The other issue, however, is this, and it's the other side of the coin, and it has to be said. Palestinians like to talk about what they call international legality, ash-shar'iyya ad-dawliyya. Palestinians love to talk about international legality or international legitimacy. Buttresses our cause. Well, there are elements of international legitimacy, Security Council resolution this or General Assembly resolution that, which buttress the Palestinian cause. But there are a couple of things in international legality which you're going to have to completely overturn if you're going to create a one-state solution. One of them is the establishment of a Jewish state, which is General Assembly Resolution 181. It called for an Arab state as well. But if you want a one-state solution, you have to undo the wall-to-wall support of the international community for Israel as a Jewish state. Now, I think that this settler colonial reality has to be undone some way. But I'm not quite sure how you overcome that incredibly massive unanimous and almost unanimous international support for a setup whereby you have a Jewish state. Now, can you set up an Arab state next to it in a situation where Israel has made that impossible? No, you can't. But how do you undo that international legitimacy that accords to Israel, which is quite substantial? I don't know. So I myself argue that you have to be talking at this stage of basic principles. You know, I don't think we are in a state where it's particularly fruitful to be asking how many states can dance on the head of a pin, 1, 2, 5, confederation, whatever. I frankly think that's putting the cart before the horse. The horse is, how do you get some form of equality? How do you move from this one-state solution with gross inequality and injustice to a just solution involving equality? And what formation that takes, confederation, cantons, multi-state, two-state, one-state, I think is less important at this stage than those basic principles. Recognizing history, understanding that political outcomes have been created, which require attention, and we have to figure out how we get to a different political outcome. I think those are the things. And when I talk to Palestinian audiences, this is what I say to them. We have to start envisaging, how do we plan to live with the Jewish Israelis as Palestinians? I mean, what future do we envisage for ourselves that we can, it doesn't mean you sell it to them, but you at least tell them what you're trying to do and what you envisage, not just for yourself, but for them. And as a structure for your country in the future, for this shared, what has to become ultimately a shared country. You know, this is not North Dakota and South Dakota, vast areas where you can divide them. This is a tiny little country. I used to be able to get to Ramallah from Jerusalem in 20 minutes. This is before a lot of traffic, and of course before the wall and the checkpoints and all of that stuff. I used to be able to get to Nablus in an hour. I used to be able to get to Tel Aviv. It's a tiny little country from Jerusalem. Tiny little country. You could partition it. I mean, you know, it's not impossible. But I think anybody who suggests doing that has to understand a bunch of things.
Thank you. Now, I just have one more follow-up question related to the points that you just made, and it regards the exacerbating the situation rather than ameliorating the situation. But before I ask that last question, please, audience members, if you have questions for Dr. Khalidi, please enter them in the chat, and my colleague, Dr. Mutaseb, will forward them to me. So my last question here, which relates to the point that you just made, regards United States actions and activities, policies that exacerbate the situation on the ground. And my question is, how are we to interpret unilateral U.S. executive recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Syrian Golan, or over the West Bank. Aside from the appeal to the Israel lobby and evangelical Christian voting base that is beyond electioneering and optics, what are the actual ramifications of such statements on the ground in Palestine? Is this a green light for more land theft and more facts on the ground? What is the significance of such illegal and absurd unilateral U.S. executive statements and pledges, such as Donald Trump's recent slew to Netanyahu?
Right. The United States is a major part of the problem. It has not been a part of the solution for decades. There were some feeble attempts, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, to actually ameliorate the situation. They actually tried to do something, to mediate between the Arab countries and Israel, to get Israel to accept refugee return, to get Israel to give up some of its territorial gains in the 1948 war, to stop Israel from developing nuclear weapons. The United States actually played a role whereby, although under Truman it helped to make the establishment of the state of Israel possible, they tried at different times in a feeble way to be part of the solution. They have been a part of the problem pretty much ever since President Johnson came into office. A big part of the problem. Sometimes a major part of the problem. Sometimes they're making war on the Palestinians. When Israel drops American ordnance from American planes with American avionics on Palestinians, the United States is the United States government is violating its laws, because exports for are only allowed of arms are only allowed for defensive purposes. And what defensive purposes served by killing 1,700 Palestinian civilians in 2014, I think would have to be explained before a court of law. What defensive purpose is being served? 500 children are murdered by American weapons. This serves a defensive purpose? That's the American arms export law. So the United States is a part of the problem. I mentioned it's putting its big fat thumb on the scale. Mm-hmm. We learned this in the negotiations. Anybody who's dealt with the United States has understood that. Ben Rhodes has an interview, a podcast with Peter Beiner, in which he talks about his own experience as an aide to President Obama and the kinds of pressures he came under. And so that's the United States. I've argued that the United States, as a great superpower in any future negotiation, absolutely has to be at the table, but it should be on the Israeli side of the table. Mm-hmm. So the Palestinians are negotiating with the Americans and the Israelis. Mm-hmm. It's not the Americans in the middle. They are not a mediator. They're not a broker. They are part of the problem. Mm-hmm. You have to solve that problem of America as well as the problem of Israel. Now, having said that, it is true that for all the favoritism that the United States has shown to Israel, for all of the support that the United States has given to Israel, Trump took that to an entirely different level. The limits, the brakes, the constraints that had served to somewhat moderate American support for Israel, only somewhat. I mean, let it be said, only somewhat. The weapons were being used under Obama, not just under Trump, against Palestinians. The 501c3s, Friends of the Israel Defense Forces, the 501c3s that fund every single settlement, the 501c3s that are funding all kinds of objectives that are probably should be illegal, and which involve a huge pipeline of money to Israel, even probably almost as much as the $3.8 billion in arms support that we annually give to Israel. Those things have continued under multiple administrations. That's not just Trump. But Trump put a hell of a lot of icing on that cake. Among them, some of the things you mentioned. Adjudicating Jerusalem, which has since 1947 been considered an issue that has to be resolved in terms of United Nations resolutions and in terms of traditional American positions, which were quite close to those United Nations resolutions. He just tossed out the window. He said, Jerusalem belongs to Israel. Israel is sovereign. End of discussion. He said the same thing with regard to the Golan Heights, something the United States has never accepted. He said the same thing in a variety. He said the same kinds of things. His administration said the same kinds of things in a variety of other regards. We're now going to see a snapback to the traditional, extremely pro-Israel positions of previous administrations. Mm-hmm. Not quite as luridly, as obsessively, slavishly devoted to the most extreme positions of the Israeli right, but support for the consensus set of Israeli positions. Israeli security includes bombing everywhere from Baghdad or potentially Tehran to Tunis. Israeli security includes killing 500 Palestinian children in 2014. Israeli security covers almost anything. You can poison people, you can assassinate them, you can cut off the calories into Gaza. Israeli security. You mention that, and everybody in Washington has to drop to their knees and say, "Yes, sir." It's extraordinary. So those kinds of that kind of knee-jerk support for tropes that have been generated by Israel will continue under the Biden administration. The president himself, all three top people at the State Department, certainly Tony Blinken, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker, and Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, are all committed to those theses, as are most American diplomats, as are most senior American officials. So we are not going to see a new era of American even-handedness. We're going to continue to deal with the problem of the United States and of its malevolence in terms of the Palestine issue.
Thank you so much. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Mutaseb.
No, I just want to point out that we have a few questions from the audiences. I put them in the private chat. If you want to ask that, they can raise. I'll publish this later. Okay, go ahead.
How do you want me to address them? I see a question about Biden administration. I've sort of answered that one.
Yes, Dr. Yagobian is going to look at this and read.
Okay, great. Great.
Okay, and I'm not sure if they're going to be put up on the screen, but here is let's see, and I need to read in. This first question that we received regards how to deal with Israel's nukes. Then this relates to the fact that Israel is a nuclear power, and the student question asks, Jewish Israelis will not allow a Palestinian finger near that button. Short of Israel denuclearizing, could equality extend to all things except that? So I guess the question revolves around Israel nukes in this context of
right.
a one-state solution.
That's an interesting question. I think here again, part of the problem is the United States. The United States is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and Israel is in violation of that treaty. Iran is a signatory, and as far as we know, it probably is not in violation. Is it trying to develop a nuclear weapon? I personally don't know. But if it is, I promise you, a lot of people are going to come down on Iran like a ton of bricks. Nobody comes down on Israel, which has, according to one estimate I read, 90 nuclear warheads and a triad of systems to deliver those nukes. It has submarine-launched ballistic missiles with submarines capable of carrying them. It has long-range missiles, ballistic missiles, and it has an air force, one of the most capable air forces in the world, with the most highly advanced stealth technology, courtesy of the United States, whereby it can deliver from air, land, and sea. I haven't even talked about cruise missiles. They can put nuclear warheads on most of those delivery systems. So we have one of the great nuclear powers of the modern era, not quite the level of the United States, Russia, and China, maybe Britain and France, but up there. Certainly perhaps with India and Pakistan, maybe probably more advanced, certainly more advanced than North Korea, about which no one is allowed to say anything. In fact, I understood from something I read recently that American presidents have been pressured by the Israelis over a number of years into agreeing to not allow the American government to talk about it. So government employees are not supposed to, when the issue is raised, well, you want to stop Iran or Saudi Arabia or Egypt from having nuclear weapons. What about Israel? American diplomats are not supposed to be able to address that issue. Well, I think you start by unraveling that kind of nonsense. There is a problem of nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. Sooner or later, other powers are going to try and acquire nuclear weapons. That's probably a bad thing if it can be stopped. Now, only a couple of countries have given up nuclear weapons or the capability to produce them, or the willingness to test them. I'm not sure that Israel it's possible to ever persuade Israel to do that. But in a situation where the different approach is taken to Iran, I would argue that Israel is now able to operate in a situation where it has no regional rival of any stature whatsoever. There's almost no Iraqi state. There's almost no Syrian state. The Egyptian military is limited by treaty and is banned from entering part of its territory that adjoins on Israel, the Sinai Peninsula. So no threat there. The danger of Iran, which is massively overhyped by an industry involving hundreds of PR professionals and hundreds of so-called policy experts and a chattering class that repeats nonsense about Iran's capabilities and intentions. Something has to be done about that, frankly. Now, does that mean this real nuclear non-proliferation in the Middle East? I don't know. I would hope so. I would hope that this is a region that whether we're talking about Turkey or Egypt or Saudi Arabia or any other potential nuclear power can be, or Iran for that matter, can be persuaded and then locked in by treaty into not proliferating nuclear weapons in a situation where Israel's nuclear arsenal is somehow brought under control. Mm-hmm. How, I don't know. But the idea that Israel is in some kind of existential danger is, of course, the basis for this. And that's a problem in and of itself. Mm-hmm. The idea that Israel's existence is menaced, its very existence is menaced, is something that's obviously rooted in the traumas of the Holocaust, when the existence of the entire Jewish people was menaced. Mm-hmm. And had Hitler had his way, it would have been ended. So there's a basis for this fear, obviously. But translating that 3/4 of a century into the present, in a situation where Israel bestrides the region like a colossus, mm-hmm. and is the only country in the region with nuclear weapons, is absurd. Other people are threatened by Israel. Israel is actually not threatened in terms of its existence. Is the security of its citizens under threat? Yes, of course they are. That's the case. But that's not an existential threat. Mm-hmm. We, United States, and the Soviets, people of the Soviet Union, faced an existential threat during the Cold War. We could all have been annihilated. I was living in Korea in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Mm-hmm. My father worked for the UN. We thought we were going to die, all of us. Mm-hmm. I was a high school student at the time. And everybody in the world could have been fried had things gone wrong, had Kennedy and a few other people, Khrushchev and a few other people not done the right thing. That was existential danger. Was Israel an existential danger in 48? Yes, perhaps. Has it been an existential danger since then? Well, Israelis may have thought they were. Some of them, many of them, but probably not. And it certainly is not today, not in 2021. Could it be in the future? Well, nobody knows. But as of this moment in time, this massive nuclear power is held in the hands of a country which has convinced everybody else that it is an existential danger. When I would argue it definitely is not. Does it have dangers in its environment? Yes, dangers to the security of its population. But so do most other countries, and they don't need nuclear weapons, and they don't need to bomb Israel's bombed eight Arab capitals over the last several decades. There are a lot of people who have reason to be afraid, not just Israelis, and some of them have reason to be very, very afraid. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question. This is shifting gears a bit. The student writes, I hope this question is not off-putting, but are there any biblical implications as far as the position of Israel and Palestinian ever taken into consideration?
It's not off-putting. It's a little it's a hard to answer question. I mean, obviously, the Bible is important for believers. For that matter, the Quran is important for believers, because both the Bible and the Quran, both the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the Quran, all three of them, are very explicit about the connection between Judaism and the land of Israel and Palestine. There's no question about that. And that is transforming that into the basis for nationalism is fundamental to Zionism. It's fundamental also to Protestant Zionism, mm-hmm. Christian Zionism, which is essentially Protestant Zionism, in particular these days evangelical Zionism. Mm-hmm. A specific reading of the New Testament, the revelation of St. John the Divine, started in the 19th century, whereby the restoration of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was essential for the end of days, yada, yada, yada. So this is, if you believe certain ways of reading the Bible, whether the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, or for that matter, the Quran, Surah Bani Israel, Surah Al-Isra, which starts سبحان الذي أسرى بعبده ليلا من المسجد الحرام إلى المسجد الأقصى الذي باركنا حوله, which starts with this passage about the Prophet's night journey, talks about the destruction of the temple, talks about the Jewish connection, it talks about Adam, it talks about Moses. I mean, much of the matter of the Hebrew Bible is reiterated, especially in that surah, but in other surahs of the Quran. So if you believe the Quran, or if you believe the Hebrew Bible, or if you believe the New Testament, you believe in a connection between Judaism and the prophets and Palestine. I mean, if you're a believer. Now, is that a basis for a modern historical claim? In my view, no, it's not. Has it been transformed into one by Zionism? But whether by people who believe in it, i.e. people who really believe in the greater land of Israel, as is the case with many Orthodox nationalist settlers and a chunk of the Israeli right, or whether it's sort of expedient. You're not necessarily a believer and you don't believe in Israeli rights, national rights as based on the Bible, but the Bible, serves a useful purpose here. And there is a connection between Judaism and Palestine, whether you believe that this is the same people exiled and now returning, or whether you understand that modern Judaism is a completely different thing, and the Jewish people, whatever they are today, are not the same group that we read about in the Old Testament. So the Bible is very important. It's important in terms of a justification for Zionism. It's important in terms of belief systems, certainly of many Jews and most Jews perhaps, and many Christians, and also should be for the beliefs of Muslims. If they read their Quran, they would say, yes, there is a Jewish connection. I mean, I quote a letter from an ancestor of mine to Theodor Herzl at the very outset of the book. And of course, he takes Jewish claims, religious claims, not claims to modern national rights, as a given. He says, we are cousins. Why? Because we're all children of Abraham, children of Hagar, children of Sarah, blah, 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 blah. So for him, who is a believer, he could write to Herzl, who is of course Jewish, and say, yes, we share this understanding. And any pious Muslim, any pious Christian, any pious Jew presumably shares some aspects of that understanding. Does that mean modern national rights trump other people's? Absolutely not, in my view. Or we would have a Muslim Spain, or we would have undo thousands of years of history with those kinds of claims.
Thank you. There's another question here, and I think this might bring us to the end. We'll see how it goes, but I think it would be a fitting question, an important question to potentially end on. The student Ina Martinez asks, my question, is there a worldwide solidarity movement of indigenous peoples, and how can we, that is people worldwide, help Palestinians? This might be a good opportunity to also mention potentially BDS and your thoughts on the BDS movement, which I believe is probably the only game in town regarding actual effective resistance.
Right. That's a really good question, and the short answer is yes, but I'll expand on it, of course. Yes, there is beginning to be, for the first time in the 21st century, a connection, an intersectionality is the fashionable term today, between, in particular, indigenous peoples and supporters of the indigenous peoples' rights, which didn't exist before. The Palestine issue was supported by people in the era of decolonization for different reasons. It was not seen in terms of indigenous people, and it was not seen necessarily in terms of settler colonialism, though sometimes it was. And I think settler colonialism is crucial to this, as are indigenous people's rights, as are issues of racism and equality. And I think that putting the issue on those grounds makes it an unassailable issue. It doesn't tell you what the roadmap is. It doesn't tell you how you get from here where we are today, where, for example, Latinx populations in the Southwest are discriminated against, or where indigenous peoples are still suffering multiple aspects of their treatment over multiple centuries by the white settler state that has taken over their land and stolen their patrimony and so forth. But we have an awakening to those things in the current era that I have never seen before, not just in the United States, I mean, worldwide. You see it in Australia, you see it in Canada, you see it especially in settler colonial states. But you also see it in states where systemic racism is an issue. I mean, read about the controversies roiling France. These are controversies that have to do with France's colonial past, with France's settler colonial past in Algeria in particular, and France's colonial past generally in West Africa and North Africa, where the minority populations who are systematically discriminated against in France, and then who are attacked as enemies of laïcité, of secularism, and of the French Republic, because they protest their being discriminated against. It's the most outrageous doublespeak on the part of a whole range of intellectuals and politicians in France. This is linked to this global awakening, if you want, or global upsurge, if you want, that realizes that there are connections between indigenous peoples and between major groups, mostly results of imperialism, colonialism, and settler colonialism. I mean, you have a minority population in Britain and a minority population in France because of British and French colonialism. They went to those countries, they stole their riches, they occupied them, dominated them, imported the people sometimes as slaves, sometimes as indentured workers, sometimes because so many of their workers had been killed in World War I and they needed people to work, or World War II, and they needed people to work in their factories. And then they discriminated against them and treated them in terms of systematic racism. So these are sequels of colonialism and sequels of settler colonialism, which I think people are recognizing are linked together. And it's not just indigenous peoples. It's other people who realize that they can't live in these societies until these ills, these evils are addressed. You can't live a proper life. It's not just, in other words, the oppressed who's suffering. It's the oppressor is tortured in different ways. I mean, read Faulkner. Faulkner himself was a racist, but Faulkner understood the cost of racism for white people. So you read a book like Absalom, and you realize he's talking about the cost of racism for his people, even though he himself was a bigot. You read Conrad, and you come to the same conclusions. He understands that colonialism and imperialism has a moral and a human cost for the oppressor. I mean, he sees the African. And he himself is a white racist, Conrad. And you read something like Heart of Darkness, and you understand he understands imperialism as an evil at the same time that he is an imperialist. And I think that we've gone beyond Faulkner and Conrad today to an era where people are awakened. I don't want to use the term woke, but are awakened. Not enough. You had 74 million people vote for a bigot and a racist in the last election. They weren't all bigots and they weren't all racists, but they were willing to, at the very least, overlook the man's misogyny and his bigotry and his anti-immigrant attitudes in order to vote for him. So not enough people by any means. And that brings me finally to BDS. BDS is a strategy. BDS is boycott, divestment, and sanctions is an approach generated by Palestinian civil society. In part in response to the flaccid, empty, banal, meaningless approach of Palestinian political leaders who had failed and have failed and are failing utterly to move the Palestine cause forward. So Palestinian civil society sort of picked up the baton and argued for a vigorous campaign to put pressure on Israel through civil society means, boycott, divestment, sanctions. And I think something should be said in the face of the campaign against BDS. Boycott in particular is as American as apple pie. You would not have civil rights legislation in the United States. You would still have Jim Crow segregation, outright legal bigotry, were it not for boycotts. Ireland would not be free were it not for boycotts. The term boycott comes from Irish peasant tenants boycotting the land agent of an English lord. The land agent's name was Captain Boycott. The Irish originated it in their struggle for liberation against British settler colonialism. The Indians picked it up. The Indian Congress movement employed boycott as one of its main tactics. India would not be free. Ireland would not be free. South Africa would not be free. The South of the United States would still be under segregation, and we would have the stigma of racist law in the United States were it not for boycotts. It's as American as apple pie. Anybody who tries to legislate against it is not just violating the First Amendment, which every court that has had this thing brought before it has agreed. Mm-hmm. He's violating something that's central to what has made the United States a somewhat more egalitarian country, and it has helped in the liberation of people all over the world. So it's a tactic. It's up to the Palestinians to come up with a strategy. What do they want? How do they get there? And that's something that's missing. But right now, as I think David has correctly said, it is the only game in town. And it's remarkable how responsive people have been on campuses and in churches and some unions all over the country to the appeal of BDS.
Well, that brings us officially to exactly 1:30. The book is The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017. The author is Dr. Rashid Khalidi. We're so blessed to have had you today as our guest, and I hope the audience paid close attention and enjoyed your talk as well and learned a lot from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. We have to conclude the session. We have Dr. Masar with us now. We apologize for the rest of the questions. We could not actually have time to answer them. And I will mute now and end the broadcast. Thank you so much. But you can stay on the stage.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.